My name is Jaymee, and I am currently a student at the University of Canterbury, and I've had the privilege of spending my summer at Lincoln working with my amazing supervisors, Raven and Aline. I'd just really quickly love to acknowledge and thank them for all their support and guidance through the whole process. It's been really amazing. So, to begin, as a team, we were really interested in evaluating New Zealand's biosecurity system, particularly in light of MPI's recent proposed amendments to the Biosecurity Act, and I was particularly interested in Māori experiences and perspectives within this system. So because of that, my research question became, how has Māori participation in biosecurity governance and decision making evolved over time, and what does this mean for future partnership? Before I change slides, I also just want to acknowledge that the scope of my research is pretty limited, and so it doesn't represent all Māori perspectives. Māori have been articulating these positions for generations, and my work simply brings together some of those positions into one place. The way I went about answering my research question was by developing two data sets. The first was a historical timeline, which traces the evolution of Māori participation in biosecurity governance and decision making from 1835 to 2025. I used 11 peer-reviewed journal articles, theses, and Y262 to create this, and those sources were compiled and organized into an annotated bibliography, which also later informed my literature review. Some of the key events on this timeline, to keep it brief, is Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which affirmed Māori rangatiratanga over taonga, ko Aotearoa tēnei, which stated that consultation with our authority does not give effect to Te Tiriti guarantees, and some more recent shifts towards partnership, including Te Urewera being recognised as a legal entity and Biosecurity New Zealand's treaty-grounded Māori strategy. The second data set was a document analysis of 60 sources from 2020 to 2025, and this time frame was chosen to help me understand where Māori are situated in the biosecurity system today. These documents came from central government, regional councils, iwi and hapu plans, and again, Y262. These documents were organized into a spreadsheet, stored in Zotero, and then coded in Vivo. And you can see the 6 codes that I used to analyze these documents with on the slides. A couple of key patterns that came from this analysis was that there was really strong agreement that Māori participation improves biosecurity outcomes and that Te Tiriti is relevant, but a really big point of tension and disagreement was around what partnership means in practice. Some more key findings that came from this analysis and the timeline are that Māori participation in biosecurity has increased and there is greater recognition, more engagement, and stronger inclusion, but decision-making authority largely remains unchanged. There's also a really clear gap between policy and the law, with policy speaking the language of treaty partnership and Māori leadership, but legislation, particularly the Biosecurity Act, continuing to centralise authority and not embed treaty obligations, which is also reinforced by inconsistencies across different environmental statutes, most notably HASNO, which does feature a treaty clause. Another key finding is that Māori aspirations are very clear. There are repeated calls for shared decision-making, rangatiratanga, and legislative change that are consistent, articulated, and repeatedly documented across iwi regions in time, essentially since the 1800s when power was first centralised. So, taken together, these findings suggest that the limits on Māori participation are not procedural, they're structural. The evidence shows that participation has increased, engagement has improved, and relationships do exist, but all of this still sits within a system where authority is already decided. So the issue isn't a lack of participation, it's that the system's designed in a way that prevents authority from shifting. And this matters because treaty partnership cannot exist without the redistribution of authority, and recognition and redistribution are not the same thing, because while the system can include and value Māori, it's not the same as sharing power. And this is why future partnership will depend largely on the legislative architecture and how well it reflects rangatiratanga, because only legislation can redistribute that authority, and if the legislation doesn't change, then the outcome won't either. So to conclude, looking forward, the question isn't really about whether participation should be greater or whether Māori should be involved. It's whether the system is willing to reconsider how authority itself is structured. Ngā mihi nui, thank you very much.
Questions? Lovely.
New Zealand relatively recently started this government industry agreements where biosecurity responsibilities are shared a little bit between MPI and the industries. And I wondered whether you found that Māori had a greater voice through government industry agreements as part of an economic collective or not.
Yeah, I did look a little bit into the GIA agreements, and I think in the proposed amendments, they did talk about potentially having some Māori representation on there because MPI doesn't think that they can accurately reflect Māori interests. And I definitely think that could be beneficial. I almost would go a step further and wonder whether Māori would work better if they almost had their own sort of GIA type agreement structure that they could work together with MPI.
I could follow up. Obviously, there's similar issues with the conservation estate, which often is neglected in many biosecurity decisions, with biosecurity being very strongly economically focused. Did you find that was also an issue, that the values that Maori might have, taonga species that are native, were undervalued in the system, so therefore there's no voice for that element anywhere in the legislation compared to crops like Pinus radiata or kiwi fruit?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think biosecurity decisions decide which knowledge systems are more important and whose authority counts and which risks should be prioritized. And so I definitely think that there probably is a lot of an economic focus, and that definitely drives what's protected and what's not, and that isn't necessarily aligned with how Māori view taonga species and risk prioritization.
Thank you.
Peter, did you want to ask your question?
I wanted to ask, so you said one of the problems is that the Biosecurity Act really doesn't have anything about relationships with Māori. So is that a quick fix that actually we could just fiddle with the Biosecurity Act and that would solve the problem? Or is this a throw the system up in the air and start thinking about it again needed?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the short answer would probably be, I don't really know. I think that a really good starting point would definitely be to include some sort of treaty clause in the Act, and or embed treaty obligations a little bit better, or have some sort of GIA agreement structure or something like that. But I think that probably is something that Māori for decades who have been working on this would have a much better answer than I would, and something that definitely could have a lot more research and a lot more depth given to.